A lot of times when questions come up about LGBT inclusion in the church, it's one side trying to prove the other side that they're wrong. Okay, you're wrong and we're right. But perhaps there's another way to think about having this conversation. When Paul talks about conservatives and progressives being in the same community in the church in Rome, and he writes them in the book of Romans, chapter 14 and chapter 15, he has a different way of thinking about it. What he says is, he says two things. Number one, don't judge each other. That's Romans 14, verse 13. He's literally talking about moral disagreements in the church between conservatives and progressives. Don't judge each other. And then he wraps it all up in Romans 15:7 when he says, accept one another as Christ accepted you. So that's a different way to think about it. Maybe we could coexist. And maybe there's a way that we could be in community with people we disagree with, because perhaps there's a range of interpretation of Scripture. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have earnest discussion and debate about how to read Scripture. What does it really say? What's the best practice for humans to honor God and for people to flourish? And there's plenty of that in Romans 14 and 15 as well. But the approach is different. It's gracious. There's a lot of curiosity. And so one way to think about this that has just struck me recently is think about it as a shotgun pattern. You know, if you were to shoot a shotgun against a blank wall, it would be a pattern of a whole bunch of different pellets hitting the wall, right? It's not a rifle shot where you're just trying to hit the target in the center. I grew up hunting. I hunted geese and ducks and all kinds of stuff. And what's so interesting is when you shoot a shotgun and you're out hunting for dinner, so to speak, it's not always the pellet that hits dead center in the target that's the one that brings down the bird. Sometimes that one actually misses because the head's over here and the body's over there. And so what if there were a range of appropriate and helpful interpretation of Scripture, and that range is actually a gift from God? One example I think of in the early church where they saw things so differently, and that is recorded in Scripture, is food sacrificed to idols. This was a major issue in the first century. It was a Ten Commandment issue around morality. Jesus taught in Mark chapter 7 in the Galilean countryside in, AD 32 or something like that, that all foods were clean. All foods. Then you get the Jerusalem Council. They gather in Jerusalem, and let's call it AD 49. And they say, you know what? Some food is unclean, food that's been sacrificed to idols. Don't eat that. Then you get Paul, probably 10 years later, could be 6 years later, depends how you think about it. But in both Corinthians and Romans, so he's writing to southern Greece and to central Italy at the time, he says, all food is clean. Eat whatever you want. Then you get Jesus again. In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, he's writing to the churches, and to the churches in Thyatira and Pergamum. This is probably close to AD 90. Jesus says through the Apostle John, he says, don't eat food sacrificed to idols. That is not what you should be doing. So 4 different instances recorded in Scripture in different cultures and different times and different places with different approaches to this moral issue. I'd like to suggest an approach that I think is helpful, which is this approach of listening to each other, trying to honor each other, respect each other, be curious about each other, and look for what's reasonable in each other's arguments. I want to close with this quotation from Caroline Simon from her book, Bringing Sex into Focus, which is by InterVarsity Press. And she writes this: could our divergence of perspectives become a resource for Christian discipleship? When you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? When you love those who share your views on matters you think central to the faith, What credit is that to you? You don't need grace for that. We do need grace and mercy and wisdom and a life saturated with prayerful seeking to live out our life together in light of our very real disagreements. Come journey with us at Small Church Big Table as we explore what LGBT inclusion looks like in the church.